Russia is not just a country, it is a force of nature. And in the winter of 1941, nature fought back. The Blitzkrieg died in the snow outside Moscow, and the long, bloody road to Berlin had just begun. Capture this city, and the Red Army collapses. But that officer does not know something. He does not know that he is looking at a mirage. He does not know that this is the closest the Third Reich will ever get to victory. He does not know that in 48 hours, the greatest military machine in history will not be marching into Moscow. It will be running for its life. Welcome to the story of Operation Typhoon, the battle that proved the Wehrmacht was mortal. To understand why the German army collapsed at the gates of Moscow, we must first understand the arrogance that brought them there. 5 months earlier, in June 1941, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa. It was a masterpiece of violence. 3 million men, 3,000 tanks. It was the largest invasion in human history. For the first few months, it looked like nothing could stop them. The German Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War, was tearing the Soviet Union apart. The Red Army was not just being defeated, it was being annihilated. Entire armies were encircled and captured. Minsk fell. Kiev fell. By October, the Germans claimed to have captured over 3 million Soviet prisoners. In Berlin, the mood was euphoric. Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister, had already prepared the headlines for the final victory. Hitler declared that the enemy was, quote, broken and will never rise again. On the map, the road to Moscow looked open. The German High Command, however, made a fatal calculation. They looked at the numbers, but they did not look at the map. I mean, really look at it. They did not calculate the sheer vastness of the Russian steppe, and more importantly, they did not calculate the weather. On October 2nd, 1941, Field Marshal Fedor von Bock launched Operation Typhoon. This was intended to be the final blow, the knockout punch. The objective was simple: encircle Moscow, destroy the remaining Soviet forces, and end the war before winter set in. At first, it seemed to work perfectly. The panzer groups, led by legendary generals like Heinz Guderian and Hermann Hoth, sliced through the Soviet lines like a scalpel. In the cities of Vyazma and Bryansk, the Germans pulled off 2 massive encirclements. It was a tactical masterpiece. Another 600,000 Soviet soldiers were trapped. The road to Moscow was wide open. There were almost no reserves left between the German tanks and the capital. Panic gripped Moscow. In the Kremlin, Joseph Stalin was reportedly stunned into silence. Government offices were evacuating. Smoke rose from the courtyards of the secret police headquarters as thousands of sensitive documents were burned. The British and American embassies packed their bags. The trains leaving the city were packed with desperate civilians. There was looting in the streets. The symbol of communist power was on the verge of anarchy. It looked like the end. But in war, the seeds of defeat are often sown in the moment of greatest victory. While the German generals were celebrating the encirclement at Vyazma, something began to change. The German advance began to slow down, not because of Soviet resistance, but because of physics. The German war machine was built for speed. It relied on trucks, motorcycles, and tanks moving fast on paved roads. But Russia had very few paved roads. And in October, the autumn rains began. This phenomenon has a name in Russia. It is called the Rasputitsa, the time without roads. It is difficult for a modern audience to understand what Rasputitsa really means. It is not just mud. It is a deep, viscous soup that swallows everything. A single truck could sink up to its axles in minutes. Horse-drawn carts, which carried the vast majority of German supplies, became useless. The mighty panzer tanks, the pride of the Wehrmacht, which had conquered France in 6 weeks, were now burning fuel just to move a few kilometers a day. The Blitzkrieg was designed for speed. Without speed, it is just a traffic jam. By late October, the supply lines were stretching to the breaking point. A German tank division needs hundreds of tons of fuel and ammunition every single day. But the trucks were stuck in the mud 100 miles back. The shells weren't arriving. The food wasn't arriving. And crucially, the winter clothing wasn't arriving. The German High Command had gambled everything on a short campaign. They were so arrogant, so sure of victory, that they hadn't even ordered winter coats for the troops. They thought the war would be over before the first snow fell. They were wrong. While the Germans were wrestling with the mud, the Soviets were buying time with blood. Every day the Germans were stuck was a day the Soviets used to dig. General Georgy Zhukov, the Soviet Union's most capable commander, was recalled from Leningrad to save Moscow. Zhukov was a man of iron will. He looked at the map and saw the reality. He knew he couldn't beat the Germans in a head-to-head tank battle yet, but he could bleed them. He mobilized everyone. And I mean everyone. 250,000 civilians, women, teenagers, old men were sent out into the rain to dig anti-tank ditches around Moscow. They worked with shovels and bare hands, often under German air attacks. They dug endless miles of trenches. They built a wall of earth and determination. This was the false calm that the German command misinterpreted. By November, the rain stopped. The ground began to freeze. The mud hardened. The German generals breathed a sigh of relief. The tanks could move again. The tracks could grip the earth. They prepared for the final lunge. They thought the worst was over. But the drop in temperature was not a blessing. It was the opening note of a funeral march. The mercury didn't just drop to freezing, it kept dropping. -10, -20. The German oil froze inside the engines. To start a tank in the morning, the crews had to light fires under the chassis, risking blowing up their own machines. The optical sights on the guns fogged up and cracked. The bolts on the rifles froze shut. And the soldiers? The German soldier, the conqueror of Europe, was still wearing his summer uniform, denim combat tunics, jackboots with steel hobnails. Steel conducts cold. The frostbite began to set in, not by the hundreds, but by the thousands. The cold was an enemy, yes, but the true killer was logistics. The Wehrmacht had advanced nearly 1,000 kilometers into Russia, but their supply lines were designed for Western Europe. In France or Belgium, a train could travel from a depot to the front line in a day. In Russia, the railway tracks were a different gauge. They were wider than European tracks. This meant German trains literally could not run on Soviet rails. Every ton of food, every gallon of fuel, and every crate of ammunition had to be unloaded from German trains at the border, moved by hand onto trucks, and driven hundreds of miles over roads that no longer existed. The result was a logistical heart attack. By mid-November, the German army needed 30 trains of supplies per day just to survive. They were receiving 3. And then, the horses began to die. We often think of World War II as a war of tanks and trucks, but the German army relied heavily on horses to pull their artillery and supply wagons. In the freezing cold, with no fodder arriving from the rear, the horses starved, or they froze to death where they stood. Without horses, the artillery couldn't move. Without artillery, the infantry had no cover. The mighty Wehrmacht was becoming an army of foot soldiers, walking into the snow with nothing but their rifles and their hunger. Bread had to be cut with axes because it was frozen solid. Weapons had to be stripped of oil because the lubricant turned into glue. Soldiers suffered from dysentery and typhus, but there was no medicine. Yet, despite this living hell, the German commanders ordered the advance to continue. They were possessed by a fever. The spires of Moscow were visible. They believed that if they could just push one more battalion forward, the Soviet regime would crumble. But inside Moscow, the regime was not crumbling, it was hardening. On November 7th, the anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution, Joseph Stalin made a decision that shocked the world. The Germans were on the outskirts of the city. The Luftwaffe was bombing the suburbs. Common sense dictated that everyone should be in a bunker. Instead, Stalin ordered a military parade in Red Square. It was a surreal piece of theater. Snow was falling heavily. The tanks rolled past Lenin's tomb. The soldiers marched in perfect formation. Stalin stood on the podium and gave a defiant speech, invoking the heroes of Russia's past. But this was not just a show. The soldiers marching in that parade did not return to the barracks. They marched straight from Red Square to the front line. It was a message to the people of Moscow, and a message to the Germans watching through their binoculars. We are still here, and we are not afraid. But bravery alone does not stop tanks. Stalin needed men. He needed fresh, well-equipped divisions to replace the shattered units defending the capital. He had those men. They were in the east, far away, in Siberia and the Far East. The Soviet Union had over 40 divisions stationed to guard against an attack by Imperial Japan. These were elite troops. They were accustomed to the bitter cold. They had ski battalions. They had warm, quilted uniforms called telegraika and heavy felt boots called valinki. For months, Stalin was terrified to move them. If he moved the Siberian divisions to Moscow, Japan might attack the undefended east, and Russia would be fighting a two-front war. It was a gamble that could destroy the nation. He needed a guarantee, and he got it from a spy, Richard Sorge. Operating deep undercover in Tokyo as a German journalist, Sorge was perhaps the most effective spy in history. He had access to the highest levels of the German embassy and Japanese officials. In late 1941, he sent a coded message to Moscow that changed the course of the war. The message was simple: Japan will not attack the Soviet Union. Japan is preparing to strike south against the United States and Great Britain in the Pacific. This was the key that unlocked the handcuffs. With Sorge's intelligence, Stalin ordered the massive transfer of troops. Trains packed with Siberian soldiers began racing west, day and night. Thousands of tanks, thousands of trucks, artillery pieces, and tanks were abandoned because they had no fuel or were stuck in the deep drifts. Panic began to spread through the ranks. It looked like history was repeating itself. Specifically, the history of 1812. Napoleon's Grand Army had retreated from Moscow along these exact same roads, freezing and dying by the thousands. Now, the Wehrmacht was facing the same ghost. Entire German units simply evaporated. They were cut off by Soviet ski troops who moved silently through the forests, striking from the darkness. The German supply lines, already weak, were completely severed. General Hoepner, commanding the 4th Panzer Group, saw his forces disintegrating. Against Hitler's orders, he ordered a withdrawal to save his men from total annihilation. When Hitler heard this, he flew into a rage. On December 16th, Hitler issued his infamous Stand Fast order. He commanded, "Fanatical resistance will be put up. The troops will fight to the last man. There will be no retreat." He stripped Hoepner of his rank and dishonorably discharged him from the army. He fired Guderian, he fired von Bock, he fired the architects of the German military success. And then, he did something that would doom Germany forever. Hitler appointed himself commander-in-chief of the army. From this point on, the war would not be run by professional generals. It would be run by an amateur fanatic sitting in a bunker thousands of miles away. The Stand Fast order was brutal. It forced German soldiers to hold positions that were indefensible. Thousands froze to death in open fields because they were forbidden to pull back to the shelter of nearby villages. However, military historians still debate this decision today. Some argue that if Hitler had allowed a retreat, the German army would have collapsed completely, just like Napoleon's. By forcing them to stand and fight, he may have prevented a total disintegration. But the cost was astronomical. By January 1942, the Germans had been pushed back nearly 250 kilometers. The immediate threat to Moscow was over. The Wehrmacht had suffered over 800,000 casualties. The Battle of Moscow was the first major defeat of Nazi Germany, but its significance goes far beyond the number of dead soldiers. It broke the myth of invincibility. Before Moscow, the world believed the German army was a supernatural force. It seemed unstoppable. Nations surrendered just at the sight of German tanks. After Moscow, the world knew the Germans could be beaten, they could be bled, they could be frozen, and they could be made to run. For the Soviet Union, the victory was a miracle, but a tragic one. The Red Army lost nearly as many men in the counteroffensive as the Germans did. The fields around Moscow were carpeted with bodies, but they had saved their capital. They had saved their nation, and they had bought the time necessary for the Allies, Britain, and the United States to mobilize their industries. Operation Typhoon failed for many reasons. It failed because of the mud and the cold. It failed because of the arrogance of German planning. It failed because of the brilliant intelligence of Richard Sorge. But mostly, it failed because of the Soviet soldier, the men and women who stood in the snow with obsolete rifles and Molotov cocktails and refused to take one step back. Today, if you drive west from Moscow along the highway, you will see a monument. It is a set of giant anti-tank obstacles, marking the exact spot where the Germans were stopped. It is just 23 kilometers from the city limits. 23 kilometers, that is the distance between victory and total defeat. That is the distance between a world ruled by the Third Reich and the world we live in today. The Wehrmacht came within sight of the spires of the Kremlin. They could see their prize, but they learned the hard lesson that invaders have learned for centuries. Russia is not just a country, it is a force of nature, and in the winter of 1941, nature fought back. The Blitzkrieg died in the snow outside Moscow, and the long, bloody road to Berlin had just begun.